Hey guys, it's Danny. Today we're gonna talk all about orchid seedlings. What they are, how do they form, what you should expect from a seedling in comparison to other types of orchids, and of course, how to properly care for them in order to end up with a beautiful and healthy, mature orchid. Today's episode, along with our entire Orchid Care for Beginners series, is sponsored by repotme.com, who offers you everything you could possibly need to properly take care of your orchid. From media to fertilizer, pots, and all sorts of accessories. Some of the accessories that I will use in this care series and in today's video are provided by RepotMe, so I will link you to their website down below in the description. Feel free to visit them at any time. So with that said, let's start by talking about what they are and how did they get here. As the name suggests, orchid seedlings are very young orchids, baby orchids if you will, which have developed from seeds. Just like most other flowering plants, orchids can actually be pollinated, and they will produce seeds. The problem is that in cultivation, it is very hard for us to grow these seeds into viable plants because they don't actually have an outer shell and they don't have nutrient reserves. They are very sensitive and prone to being attacked by fungal spores in our environment. Therefore, seedlings are mostly obtained in laboratories by professional growers. They're sowed in a nutritious medium in perfect sterile conditions until the plants are big enough that they can come out of this sterile environment into the real world. Most often than not, though, in nurseries you will find seedlings that have already been hardened off, meaning they're already adjusted to the outside environment. However, they are very, very tiny in comparison to the mature plant. But why should you choose a seedling over a mature plant? Well, maybe sometimes the seedling is much more affordable, or the mature plant is a very new hybrid or pretty hard to obtain species. And it's more likely that you will find juvenile orchids for sale rather than adults. The major downside is that typically it takes quite a few years from seedling stage to blooming size stage, depending on the orchid. Some vivacious orchids can even take up to 5 years. While with Phalaenopsis, you could look at about 3 years worth of wait. And because of this long wait, some growers really don't prefer to grow seedlings, but wait for the mature version of the plant they're interested in. This being said, there is a great appeal in growing orchid seedlings because they can give you a great sense of reward once they fully mature and you can finally see the blooms. However, though, what you should know is that seedlings are not all identical. For these reasons, in order to obtain particular orchids, tissue culture, practically cloning, is much more preferred because you know the result which you will have. However, when it comes to hybridizing, there is no way of producing hybrids without cross-pollination, obtaining seeds, growing those seedlings to maturehood, and then selecting the best individuals. So do remember that if you ever decide to buy seedlings, you might actually not get what you expect, you might get something better, you might not get something that good, and none of the individuals will necessarily look identical to the others. Another thing you should know is that orchid seedlings are not orchid keikis. Even though they're both young plants, they are very, very different. Keikis are practically baby plants created by the mother orchid. They are in essence an identical clone of that orchid, whether it's a species or a hybrid. They will also grow much faster than orchid seedlings because the orchids are technically fully formed. They're just tiny and need a little bit of time. But it's not uncommon to get flower spikes from Phalaenopsis keikis even after 1 year. This is unheard of when it comes to seedlings. And just as a side note, our previous Orchid Care for Beginners episode deals only with orchid keikis, how to obtain them, how to grow them, and so on. So if you missed it and you're interested, I'll be sure to link it to you down below in the description. Now here's the good news. When it comes to care and culture, orchid seedlings do take the exact same care as their mature counterparts, just toned down a little bit. What do I mean by this? Cattleya and vivacious orchids are really highlight orchids, and the seedlings will be highlight as well, but they will not be able to tolerate as high amounts as the mature versions. They are also pretty hot growing orchids, and they can tolerate extremes beyond 40 degrees Celsius. However, with the seedling versions, even though they are much more tolerant than some other cooler growing orchids, it is better to avoid extremes or expose them to very, very intense sunlight. And this is partly because the process of hardening does take quite a while, and the more mature an orchid is, the more experience, in quotation marks, it has with its environment, but also partly because seedlings generally do not have as many structures as mature orchids. So let's take, for example, sympodial orchids which produce pseudobulbs. Seedlings generally have much less pseudobulbs than mature orchids, and that can certainly pose some risks. Let me show you what I mean. Here I have a Stanhopea orchid and a Gongora orchid. Now, apart from the fact that one doesn't have leaves, we can also see that one is much larger than the other. Now, this Gongora had a little bit of a bad luck on transport, and look what happened. One of its pseudobulbs got rotten, and we can see it's the big one right here. It is mushy. If I press on it, it is also brown. I need to remove it. But if I do so, can we see the orchid is only left with two little pseudobulbs. One of them is so tiny we can barely see. Now, this is problematic for the orchid. The more pseudobulbs you have on an orchid, the more chances of recovery you have as well. So logically, when it comes to seedlings that don't have too many pseudobulbs, losing one is a lot more problematic. Hence why we really do need to baby these guys a little bit, make sure they are not exposed to extremes or to risky situations such as water in the new growth, which can lead to rotting, or let a pest infestation take over without actually taking measures right then and there. When it comes to watering, things can be a little different as well, since younger orchids really don't have as many storage devices as mature orchids. They will also be less tolerant of drought than mature orchids. For this reason, not only do we sometimes use much more water-retentive media for these orchids, such as sphagnum moss or small-grade bark chips, or a water-retentive mixture of sorts, but we also must be a little bit more mindful with watering time and not let these orchids be very dry for long periods of time. Even when it comes to vandas, which are very drought tolerant in their mature form, and you might know that typically you can find them for sale bare-rooted, well, when it comes to seedlings, it is much better to be mindful of their watering needs because you will see they're really not as tolerant as their mature counterparts. Generally speaking, the structures they need to grow are much smaller than mature orchids, hence they will not need as much fertilizer. So what I like to do is actually use half the quantity recommended by my fertilizer and even fertilize them a little bit less often. Nutrients are very important for seedlings because they need to support their growth. But you have to be a little bit mindful because with seedlings you are just a little bit more prone to having salt buildup and salt damage on their roots due to the fact that they just don't eat as much as mature orchids. Now, to be a little realistic, setback can be quite common on seedlings as well. Whether you're dealing with a pretty long or bad transport or just some bad luck with an orchid that maybe you didn't get the culture right from the first go, seedlings can also suffer from setback, which means smaller structures, and in my example you can see that this newer leaf is much smaller than the previous ones. Well, sadly in the case of seedlings, recovery will be even longer than mature orchids, again because they simply don't have as many structures to offer energy for new growths. Obviously, it is best to avoid setback as much as possible, so try not to stress too much these orchids since they're just so sensitive. But if you do happen to have setback, it's okay, it happens to all of us. No matter how much experience we have with orchids, just be patient. It will take time. But the whole appeal of seedlings is to go through the journey and nurture a very young orchid all the way up to adulthood. And as I was saying, sometimes you really don't know what you're gonna get, particularly if you have a hybrid, so the surprise of the flowers can actually be the whole appeal of orchid seedlings. In the end, if you think you're not ready for such a long time commitment, then just go ahead and buy mature orchids. It's absolutely fine. But if you do want to start the journey with orchid seedlings, I do suggest that you start first with more mature seedlings, maybe 1 or 2 year old seedlings. If you ever see flasks for sale, just know that they are quite difficult to manage. Since the orchids will need to harden off and you don't really know if all of them are vigorous, you might actually have some losses. Don't let that put you down, try to do your best. And if you are a beginner, as I was saying, try not to go for flasks, but more mature, let's say, seedlings. In the end, they will teach you a lot, since they will require a little bit more attention from you, and I do believe the journey is worth it. And to make things easier, why not have a few mature orchids and a few seedlings? In this way, you can get distracted with the mature orchids you have until the seedlings grow. So that's it. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed today's video. The seedling topic is one of the most requested topics here on my channel, so I hope this will help you out. Thank you Repotme for sponsoring this episode and our entire Orchid Care for Beginners series. Subscribe to my channel for more orchid videos, tutorials, experiments, updates, and other fun orchid subjects. If you wish to support the channel, do consider becoming a member or visit the merch store linked down below in the description. You can also follow me on Instagram and Facebook. It's always nice to stay in touch there as well. And I'll see you guys next time. Bye!